U.S. says it's powerless to stop the genocide that it is directly funding and supplying. In a bizarre new article titled "White House Frustrated by Israel's Onslaught but Sees Few Options," The Washington Post reports that the Biden administration believes Israel has gone too far and is killing too many civilians in its assault on Gaza, but are powerless to do anything about it. The Post's Yasmin Abu Taleb writes the following, citing anonymous U.S. officials. Quote, "As Israel's ground invasion of Gaza escalates, the Biden administration finds itself in a precarious position. Administrations say Israel's counterattack against Hamas has been too severe, too costly in civilian casualties, and lacking a coherent endgame. But they are unable to exert significant influence on America's closest ally in the Middle East to change its course. U.S. efforts to get Israel to scale back its counterattack in response to the October 7th killings by Hamas that left at least 1,400 Israelis dead have failed or fallen short. The Biden administration urged Israel against a ground invasion, privately asked it to consider proportionality in its attacks, advocated a higher priority on avoiding civilian deaths, and called for a humanitarian pause, only for Israeli officials to dismiss or reject all those suggestions. In recent days, they said, the administration has become deeply uncomfortable with some of Israel's tactics. Last week, Israel bombed the densely packed Jabalia refugee camp 2 days in a row, an attack that Israel said killed a Hamas leader, but that also killed dozens of civilians. On Friday, an Israeli airstrike hit near the entrance to Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, a strike the Israeli military said was aimed at an ambulance being used by a Hamas terrorist cell. And Israeli authorities recently expelled thousands of Palestinians who had been in Israel for work, sending them back into Gaza even as it continues to bomb the enclave." End quote. All this helpless hand-wringing is exposed for the load of ridiculous bullshit that it plainly is a few paragraphs down in the very same article. Quote, "Washington is Israel's largest military backer, and the White House has asked Congress for an additional $14 billion in aid for Israel in the wake of the Hamas attacks. But administration officials and advisors say the levers the United States theoretically has over Israel, such as conditioning military aid on making the military campaign more targeted, are non-starters, partly because they would be so politically unpopular in any administration, and partly because, aides say, Biden himself has a personal attachment to Israel." End quote. So the Biden administration does in fact have tons of leverage it can use to stop the genocidal massacre in Gaza. It just doesn't want to because it would be politically unpopular, and because Biden himself has a personal attachment to Israel. The U.S. president does indeed have a personal attachment to Israel. Biden has proudly described himself as a Zionist, and has gone on record to say that if Israel didn't exist, the United States would have to invent an Israel to advance its interests in the Middle East. In summary, this Washington Post article is telling us that Biden is powerless to stop the genocidal massacre in Gaza because he really likes the people doing the genocide and doesn't want to stop them from doing it. We've been asked to believe a lot of very stupid things since this onslaught began last month. But the idea that the Biden administration is powerless to stop a genocide that it is directly arming and supplying has got to be the absolute stupidest. Of course the U.S. can stop this. Of course it can. The U.S. is pouring weapons into Israel on an almost daily basis, is pouring billions of dollars into Israel and is preparing to pour in billions more, and is currently physically assisting Israeli operations in Gaza with drones and special operations forces, while U.S. warships swarm the eastern Mediterranean. All of this can be easily pulled away if Israel refuses to stop murdering children by the thousands in an indiscriminate bombing campaign that reportedly isn't even doing any meaningful damage to Hamas. What's that? You didn't know this murderous bombing campaign is doing no meaningful damage to Hamas? Well, let's clear that up then. A new report by the New York Times cites an anonymous U.S. military official saying that Israel has not come close to destroying Hamas leadership or even its mid-level command. Here's a quote. One senior U.S. defense official, who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive details, said the operations so far have not come close to destroying Hamas's senior and middle leadership ranks. End quote. This revelation is devastating to the Israeli narrative about what it has actually been doing in Gaza. Israel said on Thursday that it had bombed some 12,000 targets in Gaza since October 7th, and that number would surely be higher by now, especially with unprecedented levels of strikes now being reported by people on the ground. There are reportedly only some 20 to 25,000 members of Hamas in total, which means the number of airstrikes is fast approaching the total number of Hamas members in existence. Yet going from this New York Times report, no meaningful damage has been done to Hamas itself. This despite the fact that we are being told Hamas makes prevalent use of human shields, hiding their units in clusters of civilians for protection. How has Israel managed to kill some 10,000 Palestinians in Gaza without managing to do any real damage to Hamas if Hamas fighters are hiding amongst all those civilians? You'd think by sheer law of averages they'd have taken out some significant leaders with all that civilian massacring. Maybe Hamas is using really high-level human shields, the kind that don't even have any Hamas fighters hidden behind them. It's all 100% human shield with 0% combatant, the most secure type of human shield there is. The Washington Post report about Biden's imaginary powerlessness to stop this massacre makes a bit more sense when you look at an NBC News article which came out a few days earlier, which reports that White House leadership are concerned about an emerging narrative that Biden supports the killing in Gaza. NBC News reports the following, quote, Biden and his top aides have in the past week adjusted the administration's public message to emphasize concern for Palestinian civilians and U.S. efforts to get them humanitarian relief. The shift follows growing criticism at home and abroad of Biden's decision to swiftly and staunchly back Israel's military response to Hamas, while initially speaking less forcefully about protecting Palestinians. Meanwhile, images of civilian casualties in Gaza continue to ricochet around the world. If this goes really bad, we want to be able to point to our past statements, a senior U.S. official said. The official said the administration is particularly worried about a narrative taking hold that Biden supports all Israeli military actions, and that U.S.-provided weapons have been used to kill Palestinian civilians, many of them women and children. The Defense Department has said the U.S. is not putting any limit on restrictions on the weapons it's providing to Israel. End quote. So it's probably a safe bet that the anonymous U.S. officials who spoke to the Washington Post about how frustrated the White House is with Israel's unbridled murderousness are White House officials who are trying to manage the public narrative about Biden. They're trying to let the Biden administration wash its hands of this genocidal massacre like Pontius Pilate, even as it backs that very massacre to the hilt. I have said it before and I'll say it again. The U.S. is every bit as culpable for the murder of all these civilians as Israel. Don't let the empire's narrative managers try to tell you different.